Hi, everybody, and welcome to the video for Wednesday. Let's get into it. So today you will be synthesizing the forward and afterwards of Their Eyes Were Watching God with the reading that you've done for this week. We're going to be synthesizing fiction and nonfiction as we start to wrap up our last novel. I'm starting to apply some of the major skills that we have been training throughout the year. So I'm going to help you understand the forward and afterward because they're relatively written in collegiate literary critical language. So I'm going to break it down. And then I'll tell you what the task is for today. Let's get into it. So let's start with Mary Helen Washington. She is, both of these people actually are really famous African American literary critics, not just because they're African American, but also because that's the literature they focus on. This person here, Henry Louis Gates Jr., actually has a show on PBS called Finding Your Roots. It's really interesting. You could watch clips of him inviting famous people to look at essentially their 21andMe's, all of their hereditary data, their family trees. So let's first start off with Mary Helen Washington. Here's what she has to say. We actually read a little bit of her excerpt, a little bit of her foreword for last week's dialogue, the empathy, concern, and responsibility dialogue. But the excerpt I have for you today looks a little different. So I'm just going to close this. Bye. Boop. Okay, so she reads, "Here, finally, was a woman, Janie, on a quest for her own identity. And unlike so many other questing figures in Black literature, her journey would take her not away from, but deeper and deeper into Blackness, into Black traditions. Their Eyes was about a woman who wasn't pathetic, wasn't a tragic mulatto, who defied everything that was expected of her. The reaction of women all across the country who found themselves so powerfully represented in a literary text was often direct and personal." So Mary Helen Washington makes essentially these main claims about the text. This is a text about searching for identity, about Janie searching for her identity. And she realizes that in that search for her identity, she is leaning into Black traditions, right? So this could be as surface level as the language she speaks, or it could be something more abstract, like the fact that she doesn't live by the confines of traditional marriage. And she exits marriage without even divorcing formally the last person. Because what's ironic about this Black tradition at the time in 1937 is that they lack a marital tradition like that. She isn't pathetic, right? So that's a claim about the way that she's been characterized. And women across the country are powerfully represented. So she's claiming that there are several, or it's abound with, the novels abound with these avenues for empathy that readers, specifically early 20th century women readers, can have with Janie. Okay, so those are the claims essentially that Mary Helen Washington is making about the text. Keep in mind these claims, because that's what we're going to use to synthesize the actual narrative that Hurston creates. Let's move on to the afterword, Henry Louis Gates. So we could actually understand this afterword without actually having finished the book, even though we're so close. You're only 2 chapters away. We're finishing at this point. Let's read his a little bit more collegiate. "The charting of Janie Crawford's fulfillment as an autonomous imagination, their eyes," do you see this? This is a summative phrase, but it's coming before. So all of this is describing the novel. Crazy. Yes, the charting of Janie Crawford. Their Eyes is a lyrical novel that correlates the need of her first 2 husbands for ownership of progressively larger physical space and the gaudy accoutrements, which means just like adornments that make you look cool in front of other people. Gaudy accoutrements of upward mobility. That's definitely a jab at Jody specifically, with the suppression of self-awareness in their wife. There's a correlation between ownership and a suppression of self-awareness. Essentially, he's saying these men only feel like they have power when they think that Janie has no power, right? Understandably, Janie leaves those marriages only with her third and last lover, a roustabout called Tea Cake. A roustabout is just a person who's willing to do work, but they don't really have a strong skill set to do anything. A roustabout called Tea Cake, whose unstructured frolics center around and about the Florida swamps. There's this interesting connection here between Florida swamps and Mary Helen Washington talking about Blackness and Black traditions, right? Because this was largely where people were living post-Reconstruction. Black Americans were living post-Reconstruction. Does Janie at last bloom? A reference to, chapter 2, when she's looking for the joy in life pollen and flower dust sprinkled over everything. Their Eyes is a bold feminist novel, the first to be explicitly so in the Afro-American tradition, with the project of finding a voice, with language as an instrument of injury and salvation, of selfhood or independence, and empowerment, presumably of others. So here are the claims that Henry Louis Gates is largely making. This is a feminist novel in the way that it explores the damages that toxic masculinity, they didn't have that phrase at the time yet, but that toxic masculinity can have on women and on society at large, right? There are these like people who could be contributing to society, but they're stuck in stores or they're stuck in homes, even though they do have the power to lead and speak for others. Only with her third and last lover, Tea Cake, does she finally bloom. I'm curious to see what you think Henry Louis Gates means by that. Where exactly do you see Janie blooming in this most recent reading? Their Eyes is a bold feminist novel, similar to what Helen Washington was saying. The first to be explicitly so in the African American tradition, with finding a voice. Where exactly is language being used as an instrument of both injury and salvation, of selfhood and empowerment? These are the claims that Gates is making. All right. Now that we've taken the forward and afterward and we've broken them down, we can essentially move on to the one class task for today, synthesizing fic and non-fic. Here's what you'll find when you open it up. The question before you is, where in the last half of Their Eyes Were Watching God do Washington and Gates' claims about Janie and Hurston as a whole appear the most true or correct? Essentially, what you're going to do is they make claims, right? They make claims about the text. You're going to reverse engineer these claims essentially and find out where exactly do you think the evidence is coming for these claims. They read the same book you just did. So what do you think they're talking about when they make these arguments? So first, you're going to identify claims. You don't have to do all of them. I kind of just broke them down to say, here are the main ones that they're saying. You could choose one that you think is most salient. For example, you could focus on Henry Louis Gates talking about language as an instrument of both injury and salvation, and focus your entire response on that if you'd like. So which of the claims ring the most true, make the most sense to you, and or seem the most plausible or arguable? Then you'll choose a whole passage or various lines between chapters 13 and 18. That means anything that you've read for this week is fair game, but nothing before that, because we're really focusing on the last half of Their Eyes Were Watching God here, that you think best support or provide evidence for Washington and Gates' claims. And then you're going to write a body paragraph or two if you want to organize it by afterward and then forward, or by one claim against the other, but you need at least one, explaining how your selected text evidence from step 2 warrants Washington and Gates' claims. How exactly does the text evidence you chose give Washington and Gates permission to make these claims? Where is the evidence that gave birth to these claims in the first place? That's your job to essentially explain that. Okay, so you need to quote at least once from everybody, Washington, Gates, and Hurston. So make sure you are choosing your quotes wisely, chunking wisely. I think this is the name of the game here, to both save time and write concisely, is to choose small quotes so that you can spend most of the time accomplishing step 3, writing a body paragraph that explains how the evidence warrants Washington and Gates' claims. Okay, so you need to quote. Paraphrasing is fair game, of course. And I also have, let's jump to the actual task. Let's see. I have other stuff here, a little encouragement thing. This is a relatively complex task, and you're going to do it well. Okay, so I have a sample topic sentence if you need help. So here's what I write. Both Mary Helen Washington and Henry Louis Gates Jr. identify that Their Eyes is an Afro-American feminist novel about a woman who wasn't pathetic. So I'm trying to my instinct is to start threading these claims right into the topic sentence, mixing their language to make a single idea. Right? And Hurston's characterization of Janie as a woman who will not tolerate infidelity makes Their Eyes such a novel, right? Such an Afro-American feminist novel. Then I would essentially just focus on chapter 15, when Janie almost beats the crap out of Tea Cake over his flirtations with Nunky, because she thinks that Tea Cake is flirting with her and essentially isn't interested in their marriage as much as she originally believed. Okay, so another way of thinking about this task is that I am taking the claims that Washington and Gates makes which is kind of like the hard part, right? Making arguments about the text. And then I get this relatively easier part of choosing evidence and explaining the warrants. How exactly is the evidence connected to their claims? By answering this question, you are synthesizing fiction and nonfiction to make this really interesting commentary on Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is essentially the last day that we're going to be digging into this text as a piece of literature alone before we focus on our action projects. Okay, so that is everything you're doing for today. If you have any questions, go ahead and check out my hours. Check out my hours for conferences here. You may also text me through Remind. I'm going to just go out and say that it's a lot easier, not just a little easier, a lot easier to answer Remind texts instead of emails. Okay, so please use that. Email me if you must, but I would prefer Remind if you have any questions. But until then, I can bring it back. Nice. Have fun. I'll be there to help you if you need it.